The Soviet Union lost the space race of the 1960s and 70s, we all know that, but you might be less familiar with just how close the Soviets came to landing on the moon or their master plan for what they were actually going to do once they got up there. In many ways the Soviet Union was significantly more ambitious than their American rivals, and if things had turned out differently it's entirely possible that we would be seeing Russians living on the moon in the 21st century. This is the abandoned blueprint for a Soviet moonbase. Something we don't talk about very often is just how far ahead the Soviet Union was of the Americans through the entire first leg of the space race. First probe into orbit Sputnik 1 1957, first human object to reach the moon. Luna 2 1959, first person to orbit the Earth. Yuri Gagarin 1961, first spacewalk. Alexei Leonov 1965, first soft moon landing. Luna 9 1966, first spaceship to circle the moon. Zond 5 1968. Fun fact: that mission included a crew of 2 tortoises who became the first living beings from the Earth to reach the moon. So if I'd been a betting man in the mid-1960s, I may very well have put my money on the Soviet Union to put the first person on the surface of the moon. They had a lot going for them, and the Soviets also had a pretty solid plan on how they were going to do it, a plan that was likely being put into action right alongside NASA's Apollo program, and the Soviet plan most likely would have worked if not for a few strokes of bad luck and some unfortunate mistakes. In 1962 the Soviet Union began to form their blueprint for long-term self-sufficient habitation on the moon. The crowning jewel of the Soviet lunar program was the N-1L3 Super Heavy Vehicle, a gigantic moon rocket to rival the Apollo program Saturn V. The N-1 Block booster was an absolute monster. At the base it was nearly 17 m in diameter and loaded with 30 individual rocket engines that were laid out in 2 concentric rings, an outer ring of 24 solid mounted engines and 6 internal engines fitted with steering gimbals. In combination this booster would generate 10.2 million pounds of thrust, burning a mixture of liquid oxygen and cosine fuel. This was the most powerful rocket ever developed, with significantly more thrust than NASA Saturn V, and N1 would hold that title until SpaceX came along with their first Starship Super Heavy in 2021. The N1 first stage would give way to a second stage called Block B with 8 engines, and then the third stage Block C with 4 engines. This would be muscle necessary to get the L3 lunar vehicle into orbit around the Earth. The lunar stack consisted of 2 primary modules, the L orbiter and the LK lander. 2 cosmonauts would ride in the low command module, which was pretty much the same as the regular Soyuz crew vehicle, just with few tons of extra weight. The L3 would complete an Earth departure burn using a single engine, 4th stage and beyond course for the moon. Once the L3 closes in on the moon, a 5th and final engine stage is going to slow the craft down for lunar orbital insertion. Once stabilized in orbit, one of the 2 cosmonauts is going to exit through the airlock and perform a spacewalk to move from the command module to the LK lander. Then the lander is going to undock and use the 5th stage engine for a final deorbit burn before separating and coming in for a soft touchdown on the surface of the moon. After setting foot on the moon for the first time, the Soviet cosmonaut would explore the surrounding area, collect rock samples and plant the flag of the Soviet Union. After a few hours on the surface, the lander would fire up its engine again, leaving the landing legs behind and ascending back to lunar orbit for docking with the command module. The cosmonaut would then have to spacewalk back to the capsule, carrying his moon rocks along with him to return home. The LK lander would be jettisoned and the L orbiter would fire its engine on an Earth return trajectory. Landing on Earth would be the standard for a Soyuz-type vehicle. The 3 sub-modules of the L would separate prior to re-entry, with the center crew capsule coming down for a triumphant parachute landing on solid ground in a Soviet desert. Do you ever feel like you're being watched? There's a reason you don't see any of the faces or names of the people behind this channel, and that's because we all value our privacy. But you know who doesn't value privacy? Data brokers. Data brokers will scour the depths of the internet to collect as many data points on as many people as they possibly can. That stuff like your full name, email address, phone number, photographs, even social security, and a lot more. Then they sell that information to all kinds of nefarious organizations who want to exploit your data for their own gains. In 2020 the Canada Revenue Agency was hacked and all of my tax information was sold off to data brokers, who then resold that to marketing agencies and online directories. It sucked. This is where I found Delete Me. Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that will remove your personal information that's being sold online. The privacy experts at Delete Me know where to find the lists that contain your data and how to get it removed as quickly as possible. The great thing about Delete Me is that this is a permanent solution to data theft, because nothing on the internet ever truly goes away. Delete Me will continue monitoring the web and removing my information every time that it returns. This is why we are so excited to finally have Delete Me on as a sponsor for this channel. When you sign up for a Delete Me subscription, they will send your first privacy report in just 7 days, so that you can see for yourself how many data brokers and websites have been hosting your personal information. From here the privacy experts will begin to remove all of your personal data from those directories. Then Delete Me will repeat the removal process as many times as needed all year round. So get your own privacy report by signing up for Delete Me at joinme.com/R20 and use our promo code SPACERACE2 to receive 20% off any of their consumer plans. I honestly think you might be shocked to see just how much of your personal information is out there on the internet, and there's one way to find out. Join DeletMe.com/SpaceRace20. Once the Soviets had successfully achieved a crew landing on the moon and returned to Earth, their plan would move into the next phase, construction of the first moon base. Names: Viesta. The Soviet base would be a collection of 9 relatively Small modules, each one buried under a protective layer of regolith, which is essentially the rocky dusty lunar topsoil. The Vesta modules would be transported to the moon in the same way using the N1 booster and the L3 upper stages. Each one would weigh around 18 metric tons and have a diameter of 3.3 m, while in transit the module would be just 4.5 m in length, but once deployed on the surface it could be inflated using air pressure and telescope out to a final 8.6 m long. This would provide around 22 sm of total floor space. The 9 modules would be prefabricated on Earth, with each one equipped for a different purpose: command module, laboratory and warehouse module, workshop module, midpoint module, medical and fitness module, galley module with dining room, and 3 living modules. This Vesta base will be built out in 3 phases, with an initial phase 1 crew of 4 people. Once fully completed, the base would support a population of up to 12 cosmonauts. It was intended that the base would be powered by a nuclear fission reactor and nuclear batteries. Critical resources would be obtained by processing regolith to extract hydrogen, oxygen and metals. A prototype of one of these modules was even used in 1967 for a 1-year closed-cycle living experiment by the Soviet government. Based on the results of this experiment, it was planned that the units on the moon would have a false window showing scenes of the Earth countryside that would change to correspond with the season back in Moscow. The exercise bicycle was equipped with a synchronized film projector that allowed the cosmonaut to take a ride around the Russian countryside. These psychological measures were deemed important to maintain the crew's mental health. If that wasn't enough, the Soviets even had a plan for a train on the moon. It would actually run on tracks, but was considered an essential part of the base infrastructure. The 8-ton train would consist of 4 separate cars or modules. The first would be a tug, the second a crew compartment, the third would be an energy production module, either solar or nuclear, and the 4th car would be a drilling rig for resource extraction and sample taking. Each car was based on the Lunokhod rover design, using 8 wheels each with their own independent suspension brakes and electric motor. The body of the rover would shield cosmonauts from meteorite impacts and radiation by using a protective styrofoam layer sandwiched between 2 sheets of metal. Now this all might sound like a bit of fantasy, and it is, but the Soviets came very close to securing the capabilities that would have put this plan into action, and the power of the N1 rocket was the key to everything. On paper, the N1 rocket was the greatest machine the Soviet Union had ever produced. This was the epitome of mid-century Soviet design. It was gigantic and powerful. It was both ugly and awe-inspiring in a utilitarian, brutalist kind of way that only the Russians could pull off. The N1 was the brainchild of a man named Sergei Korolev. He was kind of like the Soviet equivalent of NASA's Nur von Braun, visionary rocket scientists who weren't afraid to dream big and literally shoot for the moon. One of the problems, though, was that Korolev butted heads with another Soviet rocket scientist named Valentin Glushko. He was the leading engineer designer in the Soviet space program. This was a long-standing rivalry between the two, dating back to the late 1930s, when Korolev blamed Glushko for having him locked up in the Gulag during Stalin's Great Purge. Glushko named names. Anyway, history of communism lessons aside, the main sticking point was that Korolev wanted to use the cutting-edge rocket engine technology in the N1 progenic liquid oxidizer combined with purified RP1 kerosene, the same formula as von Braun's monstrous F1 engine, but Glushko favored the more simplified and reliable method of self-combusting hypergolic fuels, specifically unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide. Now that's not to say Glushko wasn't ambitious with his own design, because he also wanted to use a full-flow staged combustion cycle to drive the N1 engine, which is the same mechanical system currently used by the SpaceX Raptor, and is well known as the most complex method possible to fuel a rocket engine. Korolev won out, and all 5 propulsion stages of the N1 booster and L3 upper stage were designed with the RP1 and liquid oxygen fuel. And here comes the big problem: Korolev never lived to see his design become reality. He died unexpectedly in 1966 under mysterious circumstances. All we really know is that he went in for some kind of routine surgery, and he came out dead. The government claims it was a failed removal of a cancerous tumor, but Glushko apparently told everyone that he died due to a poorly performed operation for hemorrhoids. Either way, leadership of the N1 project was passed down to a guy named Vasil Mishin, who is essentially famous for being incompetent. His Wikipedia page literally says he was, quote, best remembered for the failures in the Soviet space program that took place under his management, and the N1 was one hell of a failure, that's for sure. The first test launch of the N1 was conducted in February 1969. The goal was to put a modified Soyuz spacecraft into orbit and send it for a flyby of the moon. The N1 lifted off with all 30 engines firing, but it was only a few seconds in the air before things started going wrong. One of the outer ring engines flamed out, which triggered the shutdown of an opposing engine to balance out the thrust. Then only a few more seconds passed before a third engine malfunctioned. It went into a state called pogo oscillation, which is an extreme vibration resulting from combustion instability. The violent shaking tore the engine apart and started a fuel leak in the section of the booster. After 1 minute of flight, the ground team shut down power to the booster, and the rocket eventually crash-landed 52 kilometers away from the launch pad. So that wasn't great, but it could have been surprisingly worse. You know this because the second test flight went much worse. N1 launch number 2 was July 3rd. 1969. 2 weeks before NASA's Apollo 11 flight that would put the first men on the moon, the Soviets were aiming to prove that they were still competitive in the race with the Americans by sending a robotic spacecraft into lunar orbit with their own super heavy rocket. Again, the N-1 lifted off with a mighty roar and cleared the launch tower successfully, and in again mere seconds into flight there was an engine failure only. This time 29 of the 30 engines flamed out. Immediately the rocket stalled in midair, tipped over at a 45 degrees angle and fell straight back down onto the launch pad. What followed was the largest non-nuclear explosion in history. Debris from this explosion was scattered up to 10 kilometers away from the launch site, and the shock wave was able to break windows up to 40 kilometers in all directions. The fireball generated by the N-1 disaster was so immense that one eyewitness to the event would go home and write, "Today I saw the end of the world and not a nightmare." But while fully awake and standing right next to it, it would take the Soviets 18 months just to rebuild their launch complex, and in that time the Americans had landed on the moon so many times they were starting to get bored of it. NASA had definitely won the space race, and yet as they do, the Soviets pushed on. In June 1971, the N-1 rocket was placed on the launch pad for the third time, and for a third time the 30-engine block, a booster, malfunctioned. This time, it started spinning out of control and breaking apart. The remains of the N-1 were found 15 kilometers away in the bottom of a 15 deep crater. Still undeterred, the Soviets tried again for a fourth time in November of the same year, and the N-1 again lifted off and this time flew smoothly for a full 90 seconds. The burn time of the block was only 125 seconds, so they were very close, but then the fuel lines in the booster section exploded under excess pressure, causing yet another fire to break out and the Block A to explode in midair. The upper stage sections of the rocket were ejected, but for whatever reason the ground crew never triggered the Block B engines to fire, so the whole thing just fell back to the surface and made another big hole in the ground. And with that, the Soviet ambitions for colonizing the moon died not with a bang, but with one massive explosion and 3 craters in the deserts of Kazakhstan. So we're basically left with a bunch of what ifs. What if Korolev had lived? Would the N-1 have been successful under the guidance of its creator, or was Korolev wrong the entire time? Would Glow's engine have been the real key to success? And what if the N-1 had worked? How would the space race have changed with the Soviets on the moon? Would they have really built Vesta? And if they had, would the Americans have built their own moon base to compete? Obviously we'll never know the answers, but it's still really fun to think about. Meet us back here every week for more updates on everything aerospace industry and interstellar exploration related. Make sure to give the video a thumbs up today if you liked it, that really helps us out for real, and subscribe to the Space Race for more videos just like this. We do one long form essay and one news update every week, and if you'd like more, we've got 2 more on the screen for you right now.